When you ask players of today who their favorite players are, they'll often point to players from the golden age of violin playing. Players like Heifetz, Oistrakh, Elman, Chrysler. But what made these players so different, and why are they oftentimes pointed to as being people's favorite players? But before we get into that, I'm David. I've been playing the violin for over 20 years, teaching for over 10, and posting tutorials online for over 8 years now. I studied the Dounis Method, and this method is focused on teaching expressive technique, a method which Dounis created to help preserve the playing of the Golden Age. The Golden Age of violin playing started with the rise of Paganini and virtuosos of his time, and ended roughly a century later. The players of this time are identified as having a very unique and distinguishable sound, and one of the common things that people observe is that it's very easy to identify these players from their recordings, even when you don't know much else about the recording. Their sound is very unique, and it's not just because of their sound production, it's because of their expression. These players placed their emphasis on expressive playing, which meant bringing out their inner musical voice into their playing. Every note and phrase was played in a way to maximize expression. So what makes these players different from the players of today? Well, let's start with sound. While we still use the same instruments, it's hard to reproduce that sound that the Golden Age players had. Over the past century or so, the idea of sound production has changed. Many teachers teach their students to play using arm weight and pressing that into the string to get a louder sound. But this actually causes a less resonant sound, and the great players from the Golden Age didn't do that. Check out this video for more on how to get a resonant sound. The Golden Age players got their sound by lifting it out of the instrument. And you'll often notice that in videos of their playing, their bowing seems to be very light, even though they're still able to get a powerful sound. When you use leverage by doing something like pronating, you don't compromise the sound in the same way that you would by using arm weight. Arm weight crushes the bow onto the string and can actually deaden the sound, even though it will make it louder. But when you use pronation, you can still get a loud sound and still preserve the resonance of the sound. It's things like this that the Golden Age players did. Another thing that you'll often notice is their vibrato. Their vibrato in general was done with a smaller motion and was done on more notes. They didn't only use vibrato to emphasize notes, they used vibrato to open up the sound. This is a principle that's oftentimes lost in the players of today. We're mostly taught to use vibrato to emphasize notes for musical purposes, but these players, like Chrysler, used vibrato on almost all the notes that they could, and that was for the sake of creating a more resonant sound. That's not to say that they didn't also use their vibrato to emphasize notes, but their vibrato was happening all the time for the sake of getting a more resonant sound. Now let's talk about expression. While expressive playing is still a key focus of the players of today, it's hard to deny the fact that these Golden Age players simply played more expressively. When you listen to their recordings, something about them seems to bring out the music more. And that's not an accident. You see, these Golden Age players grew up in a time when audio recordings weren't invented yet, or at least weren't very popular. Players like Heifetz wouldn't constantly be listening to recordings in their practice session, and as a result, their priorities were actually slightly different. While players of today oftentimes focus on making their recordings as clean as possible, knowing that players in the future will be listening back to them, the players of this time placed their emphasis more so on musical expression. And that's not to say that they also weren't able to play very clean. Players like Heifetz have some of the cleanest recordings that you'll ever hear. But their emphasis was still on getting the most expressive playing possible, even if it was at the sake of a couple missed notes. And this is a key difference in the priorities of players of then versus today. While both expressive and clean playing are needed for a great player, it's undoubtedly more interesting to listen to someone who's very expressive and misses a couple notes than someone who plays very clean but without much expression. So, how can we learn to play more expressively? To put it simply, the key is to follow your inner musical voice. Before you play anything, you want to sing it, or at least sing it in your head, and get a very clear understanding of the phrasing and the expression. Then ask yourself these two questions. What did I play that I didn't sing? And what did I sing that I didn't play? Once you get good at capturing your singing into your playing, you'll notice how naturally expressive your playing sounds. And that's because our ears naturally pick up on playing that sounds vocal. That's something that all these Golden Age players had, and something that was really ingrained in them because of the time that they grew up in, and because of what their priorities were in their practice. Around the turn of the 20th century, Dounis noticed that these changes were happening in the players of his time. He noticed how audio recordings were more and more shifting the emphasis onto mechanical playing as opposed to expressive playing. The goal of Dounis' method was in essence to preserve this golden age of playing. And you can hear it when listening to his students, like George Nykrug and David Nadium. He called his method the science of expressive technique. And this method was created to teach players to play more expressively, and also to address technical problems that might get in the way of preventing expressive playing. In other words, he only taught technique for the sake of bringing out expression. As someone who's been studying this method for over 10 years, I can see the night and day difference between my playing before and after the Dounis method. Not only has my technique transformed to feel much more natural, but my entire mindset on how to practice and how to play more expressively has also changed. If you're interested in learning more, check out some of the resources below, including my free ebook.